So welcome back, comrades. It's our second video today, and we will try to analyze the political views of Vladimir Putin. Firstly, I would like to say that it is very complicated, especially in Poland, to make a rational analysis of Vladimir Putin. All the time we can listen the epithet that it is new Hitler, dictator, I don't know everything, but I would like, Bruno, that you make an analysis of 22 years of ruling of Putin,
Yeah,
and who is Putin in what his political views, because in one side
yeah,
the leftists are attacked him that he make he have contact with some people of the far right in Europe, like Salvini, like Marine Le Pen. But in the second, in the other side, he introduced the anthem of the Soviet Union. He celebrated the Victory Day of 9th of May. So
yes. As you pointed, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated issue, and I would say that Putin doesn't really help us to clarify this. But I would say that he doesn't help us because it's not its goal. He doesn't want to help us. He wants to carry on his own project. And one aspect of his own project is that it's not in his interest to show too clearly what is its long-term intentions. Because as we can know, Putin and I would say the Russian political tradition has much more long-term view than the Western one. And because of that, they know that they have to hide quite a lot of long-term view because Western opinion and in particular leftist opinion are not Western leftist opinion. I'm pointing that very important. It's very important because the third world left opinion are on a lot of questions very different from the Western left opinion. It's important to take into account that Putin doesn't really care about us. He has its own goal, and he cannot take us into account because he has much more to do things to do. That's first thing. The second thing we have to take into account is the fact that he's the leader of a very complicated country, which is Russia, a very complicated country because, of course, it's a very big country. And what means big country? It means country with a lot of internal contradictions, regional contradictions, ethnical contradictions, social contradictions, and so on. And it's a much more complicated country, not only because of what I told now, but because Russia is a post-Soviet state where you have a strong contradiction because what I would say it's Soviet roots combined whatever we think of them with pre-Soviet roots, which are Russian Tsarist roots, which were already very complicated because the Tsarist roots are mixed with, let's say, Tatar Asiatic traditions and Kiev Ruthenian Christian traditions. So all that is quite mixed. Mixed also, of course, with a very complicated social and economical situation. Of course, when I talk about a complicated social and economical situation, I'm talking about a Russia that was completely destroyed and plundered during the 90s, because Soviet Union was a big power. Of course, it was a big military and political and ideological power, but it was also a big economical power that was split in 15 parts. What disorganized the economy, whatever we think about Soviet Union, we had an organized and quite defined economical space that was destroyed. And this destruction was accelerated under Western pressures, because we have to remember that in the 90s, American councillors were everywhere in Russia or former Soviet Union, including in Moscow. You had American councillors in the state security system, in the so-called FSB, which was what was left from the KGB. And we had American councillors there working with their Russian colleagues, quote, which were in fact under American influence. Because we have, for example, to take into account that the Russian constitution adopted in 1993, after the killing, mass killing of the people defending the democratically elected parliament of that time, more than several hundred people were killed during this repression under Yeltsin, and a new constitution was more or less imposed on Russia by the American councillors that imposed to Russia not only a new political regime, authoritarian regime, but they imposed to Russia the complete opening of its border to foreign so-called investment, but in fact to foreign plundering. We have to take into account that the morbidity in Russia during the 90s rose of about 10 years. I mean, the Russian at the end of the 90s had a life expectancy of 10 years less than they had when Soviet Union disappeared. So if we look at the economical situation of Russia, comparing situation of Russia at the end of the 90s with the situation of Soviet Russia at the end of the 80s, the destruction of the country was never happened in human history in peaceful time. It was like a war, like if Russia was destroyed by a war, not having wars. We have to take into account. And this situation created in Russia very big, of course, economical and social tensions, but also the appearance of a completely predatory social class, which is called oligarchs, which plundered the country and take the capitals of this plundered country outside in the so-called safe haven or paradise heaven, which are under Western and American protections. In Panama, in the Delaware, in the Isle of Man, in Jersey, in Luxembourg, in Cayman Islands, very well called Cayman Islands, very symbolical name for what they are doing. And all these countries or heavens are under Western protection. We have to take into account that NATO countries are able to launch wars in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but they are not able to to control Cayman Islands and other such paradise where the money of the world plunderers are. Of course, what I'm talking now is completely humoristic. Of course, it would be very easy for the U.S. Army to control this mafia states or mafia entities. If they would like, they could do it in 1 hour, like they did in Grenada when Grenada was under the government of Marxists under Reagan. It's equally easy to invade economical so-called heaven than such little states. But of course, these states are under protection of the US and NATO policemen, let's say. So that's very important to take that into account, that Russia was plundered, but was also under the influence of this oligarchy. And that's the point I wanted to show. It's that when we think about Putin, we concentrate, and the media rather concentrate on the man Putin, and it's very useful for the propaganda, but it's because it makes us unconscious about the real importance of the fact that in Russia we have a political system, we have an economical system, we have a social system, we have social classes, and Putin is just the tip of the iceberg of the whole system. So we have to understand that Putin is not the most important issue in Russia. Symbolically, of course, it's important. Of course, Putin is an important man, but his role is not at all the one Western media wants us to convince. Putin is not a man who dictates what he wants in an authoritarian and autocratic state where he pushes the button and everything functions as he wants. Putin is just an important man within a very complicated machine, very complicated because it's a machine where we have very strong contradictions. And that's why it's very difficult to understand if Russia is a reactionary state or a progressive state, is a right-wing state or a leftist state, because all of what I told now is existing in Russia, and Putin is something like an arbiter in a football game. He has to take into account, as every Russian leader, the political, social, and economical forces that are working, that are existing in Russia, in the same time taking into account the world balance of power between United States, Western Europe, China, and all other very important state powers in the world. If we understand that, we can begin to ask questions. Who is leading Russia and in what direction? And this, of course, has to be taken into account, including the current Ukrainian war. Because, first of all, it's very easy when we talk about Russia in the left circles to define it very quickly. Oh, it's a new imperialist power. This has to be debated, but it's not very, very easy to give an answer, because what is imperialism? We forgot about. Most leftists are now not rationally thinking people. Most leftists in Western Europe, I would say, or in the United States, most, maybe not most, but a lot of them, at least the most viewed on medias are using not rational arguments but rather romantic, idealistic arguments. Imperialism now, when you say the word imperialism now, you think political expansion of states, and especially, of course, military expansion of a state. But imperialism is not that. Imperialism, if you look back to what to Lenin, Marx, but especially Lenin, because he was the specialist defining what is imperialism. Imperialism is a capitalist system which is arrived at the level when this capitalist state is able to export its capitals, to conquer foreign enterprises and foreign markets, pushing then this state to carry on a policy of expansion, of political and military expansion, so to conquer and securize those markets. And then we have to, and of course, we have to deal with that in the case of the United States. We have to understand that to a large extent, but not as large as the United States since the Second World War. But anyway, we can consider that Western European powers like Germany, like Britain, like France, to a much lower extent, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and such countries are still imperialist powers because they have a capitalist class which is linked with investment they did in the outside their countries, and to a certain extent they had to defend them and expand, eventually, of course, to expand them in those countries. But the situation looks much more complicated if we look at Russia, because in Russia, we have the so-called oligarchs. Of course, the oligarchs, they are capitalists. But that they would like to be imperialist, maybe. But are they able to be imperialist? That's the basic issues. Oligarchs, if you look, you will say, okay, they have a lot of money. They got during the time they plundered the Russian economy. But they plundered the Russian economy for themselves, of course, but mostly for Western imperialists. And if we look at the Mao Zedong definition of bourgeoisie, the Russian oligarchs, which are not sympathetical at all, but the Russian oligarchs cannot be put in the category of imperialist bourgeoisie, but in the category of what we can call, and what Mao Zedong called, and other third world thinkers like Frantz Fanon, the so-called comprador bourgeoisie. What is the comprador bourgeoisie? It's a bourgeoisie plundering its own country, working for imperialist interest or colonial interest outside of their country. It's not a free bourgeoisie, it's a bourgeoisie which depends from a foreign imperialist bourgeoisie. And you will say, maybe they export capitals. Of course, what they plundered in Russia, they put it in outside Russia. But they didn't invest it outside Russia. They put it in the safe haven, as I told you, like the Cayman Island, like Delaware, like the Isle of Man, and so on and so on. But they are not engaged in any productive imperialism, like are doing most Western multinational companies or supranational companies. It's not at all that. It's just a predatory class which is rich, and when they invest something, they invest for their luxury life, They spend a lot of money outside. I can give you an example, which is not a Russian example, which is a Ukrainian example, but it's quite the same. You know, the secretary of the Kiev mayor spent two years ago 1 week with his life in Courchevel in France, spending 115,000 euro to rent an apartment there. That's the place where they put their money. You know, I don't know if a lot of French or American bourgeois would spend so much money for their own luxury, not assuring themselves that most of their money is going to their to make more money in a more or less productive way. When I say productive, of course, it's quote, because it can be arm trade, oil trade, and so on, and exploitation of people in the world. But in a certain sense, they are working within the interest of a collective class which they are part from. They don't just spend their money in luxury habits, as do the Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. And this will send us to Putin. I will be back on this question later. But I wanted to show you what was the base of the system from which Putin arrived in power in Russia, and the system we have still in Ukraine, for example, or Kazakhstan, or other post-Soviet states. So that's very important, because the issue in Russia and in other states, and especially in other post-Soviet states, is not the question if there are an imperialist bourgeoisie, because there is no imperialist bourgeoisie in Russia, because the bourgeoisie in Russia is divided in two, but not between imperialist bourgeoisie and national bourgeoisie, but between comprador bourgeoisie linked with Western imperialist bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie. Because in Russia, it appeared also some entrepreneurs who are bourgeois, but who are working within the frame, or tending to work within the frame, of a Russian state protecting them to conquer the Russian market. Because, of course, what characterized if we come back to Mao Zedong's reflection on that, what characterized the national bourgeoisie is the national bourgeoisie is a local bourgeoisie, which aim is to conquer the local market, because they cannot imagine to conquer the world market, but at least they want to conquer the local markets. And to conquer the local market, they need a state that will protect their market against the imperialist bourgeoisie, but also inside their country against the comprador bourgeoisie. And that's why we had the Chinese Revolution, which was aimed by Mao Zedong in an alliance between working class, peasants, progressive intellectuals, and national bourgeoisie. The four stars, the little stars you have on the Chinese People's Republic flag is for these four classes, including national bourgeoisie, and because national bourgeoisie is considered was considered by Chinese communists as a social class which is opportunistic, but which can be positive for the revolution, because they can develop productive forces. And if they are under the power of the dictatorship of the proletariat, they will be directed toward the development of national productive forces, and they will not tend to go in the direction of a new comprador bourgeoisie. That's the theory we had in China. But to a certain extent, this theory is very useful for Russia, because then we can understand that in Russia, the basic question, but in all former Soviet Union, and maybe in all former socialist states, the basic question is that we have to deal, we have a class contradiction between comprador bourgeoisie linked with imperialist interests, what we can observe in Poland, which we can observe in Baltic states, which we can observe in Romania, which we can observe in a lot of former socialist states. And we have states where there is a competition, and much more visible, but in these states I told you about, we have a competition between local national bourgeois and comprador bourgeois, but the dictatorship, the economical dictatorship, is on the side of comprador bourgeoisie. And we have states when we have a national bourgeoisie trying and sometimes succeeding to get some parcel, some part of powers, some parts of power. And that's the case of Russia. That's the case of Romania, of Serbia. That's the case of Hungary now. Whatever we think about Orban, Orban is promoting the interests of the local bourgeoisie, national bourgeoisie. And that's why he's not loved in the Western circles. It's not because of the question of his human rights abuses, because, as I told you, the human rights abuses, we have them in France, in Italy, in England. But it's because of that. And to a certain extent, we have also this situation in Russia, but of course, to the scale of the country, which is much bigger. And that's one of the reasons of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict now, is that the oligarchs in Ukraine are a purely comprador bourgeoisie that doesn't want to go the way Russia did under Putin. Because what Putin means in Russia, Putin arrived in power in a situation where Russia was completely internally destroyed. And because of this destruction, if you look at Brzezinski's book, Russia was going toward disintegration, because Brzezinski told that the aim of the United States imperialism, he didn't wrote that in so clearly way as I'm telling, but it was very clear that the intention of the United States was to split Russia in 5 states, 4 or 5 states, that could not be able to compete within capitalism with American imperialism. That's what we call inter-capitalist contradiction, but not inter-imperialist contradiction, inter-capitalist contradiction, because Russia was not an imperialist state at the time of Yeltsin. It couldn't be. So it had not the force to be. So at the end of the 90s in Russia, and you have a very interesting interview of the daughter of Yeltsin, that was made much later, and she explained why she and the political milieu of oligarchs in Russia gave power to Putin. It's because she tells the situation in Russia was so bad that they feared that the communists will come back to power. And of course, they were anti-communist. And they didn't want the communists to come back to power. So they managed to invent something in the middle of the road. They understood that their absolute power was finished, as it was the case, and in Ukraine it was not finished. It's up to now because it's under American protection. But in Russia, they managed to organize something like a compromise, and Putin is the symbol of this compromise. It means that the Russian, the more irrational, let's say, oligarchs, which are bandits, but it doesn't mean when you are bandits that you are an idiot and that you are not rationally thinking. The most intelligent Russian oligarch understood that if they wanted to save their newly conquered properties in Russia, or newly conquered plundered enterprise, they had to make a compromise and accept the comeback of a certain form of state. Because if they wanted Russia not going toward revolution, they had to restore something like a state, a real state power, able at least to collect taxes and to have at least the basic money to pay salaries. Because at the end of the 90s in Russia, a lot of people in Russia working for the state were not receiving their salaries anymore. In the hospital, in the administration, in the public sectors, but also in the private sector, they were not receiving salary. So at least, even if their salary was low, the issue, receive their salary was very important. At least receive every month something. And for that you need a state which has money, and to have money it needs tax. But who can pay taxes? Of course, all the society, but especially the one who have some money, including oligarchs. So they accepted this compromise with, let's say, the patriotic forces, which wanted to rebuild a state in Russia. And this alliance, it's an objective alliance, goes from the, let's say, patriotically oriented Russians and state bureaucracy. But when we talk about patriotically oriented people in Russia, it can mean people referring to Soviet state, but it can mean also people referring to the Tsarist state, but at least to the national states. So we have people, let's say, more rationally thinking oligarchs and plunderers, patriotically oriented Russians with not really clear ideological vision, and communists. Because of course communists are much more conscious, but they knew that a certain form of state has to be rebuilt in Russia, and that's a positive trend for the whole Russian society, except for the Western pro-Western plunderers, the comprador bourgeoisie, as I told you. And that's the reason why we have a compromise in Russia up to now. That doesn't mean that there are no contradictions in Russia. That doesn't mean that Putin controls everything. That doesn't mean that all these forces I told you about are united. They are competing one with the other, but inside a situation where the consensus is that we need a state to protect us from the plunderers linked with Western imperialists. And that's the basic difference with Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, the oligarchs are governing the country the same way as they did in Russia during Yeltsin times. But they have, and for this reason, they have the support of the Western imperialists. Of course, in Ukraine, they use the Nazis because there is no other force they can rely on in Ukraine, because the left is their enemy and had to be eliminated, because the so-called pro-Russian groups are in Ukraine promoting a compromise in the same style as we have under Putin in Russia. It means that the oligarchs has to be loyal to the state and pay their tax. And in between the left and the pro-Russian, it's not the same. The pro-Russian in Ukraine can be right-wing or liberals to a certain extent, or national liberals to a certain extent. They're not left, but they have more or less interest that Ukraine has to be protected from Western imperialism for pro-Russian reason and not for left-wing reason.
Bruno,
yeah,
I would like ask you a question, because the question is, if your analysis is still actual in the time of the European Western sanction against Russia. I can give one example.
I arrive to that. I will arrive.
Okay.
So the basic situation was that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict must be seen also as a competition between two ideological and economical and social vision of the future. It's not a national conflict. It's not a conflict between Russian and Ukrainians. It's a conflict between the Russian model of oligarchy and the Ukrainian Western model of oligarchy, under the appearance of a national conflict. But using fascists and Nazi, because it's the only political force left in Ukraine able to mobilize quite large sector of the opinion, minority, but quite large sector of the opinion, because you cannot imagine in Ukraine people fighting for oligarchs against Russian. Because there is no base. I mean, whatever we think about fascists and Nazi, we must understand that this political trend, have a social base inside the society. But there is no such thing in Ukraine between fascists, left, and pro-Russian. There is nothing. There is no center. There is no center right. There is no center left in Ukraine. There is extreme right, radical left, and pro-Russian. So if you have this in mind, you understand that the oligarch in Ukraine, including Jewish Zionist oligarchs like Kolomoisky, they are with the fascists, because they cannot be with the left and they cannot be with the pro-Russian. They use the Ukrainian nationalism. They know. I mean, they're not Russian nationalists, Ukrainian, nationalists, but that's the only force they can rely on to preserve their property and their role as comprador bourgeoisie for the interest of the American and Western imperialism. And that's the basic situation, because in Russia, we have a much more interesting political life than in Ukraine, because in Ukraine, all the political life was definitely blocked after the so-called Maidan coup, because after the so-called Maidan coup, the left was progressively eliminated under very repressive methods. We have to understand that the SBU, the political police in Ukraine, is very active in killing, arresting, torturing political opponents. So we had the Communist Party, which was forbidden some years ago, and now we have 13 political parties in Ukraine which are forbidden, and 3 TV channels. And we have every day people arrested, people disappearing, people we don't know where they are, and so on. We had that before the war, but of course the situation is much worse now because of the war. And that's also one of the reasons of the war. Why Ukraine was so provocative against Russia, it was because the war atmosphere against Russia and Donbass, it's because the war atmosphere allows the political repression inside the country. And as you see now, nobody will talk about the human rights in Ukraine, because if you talk about human rights in Ukraine, you will be accused already to be a Putin's spy. In Poland, but in all the Western hemisphere, we have this problem. So that's a very important aspect of the issue. And now we have to understand why Russia and why Putin went the way he went. I don't know what Putin's think. I don't know what he is believing in or not. But I would tell you it's not important, because I'm not his confessor. I'm not a Christian Orthodox, and I don't care what is Putin thinking and believing in. What is important is to understand that Putin is at the top of a political system which is under very strong contradictions between the pro-Western oligarchs, the national bourgeoisie, and the Russian masses. That's for the inside situation of Russia. And if we look on the outside situation of Russia, Russia is in between the Western imperialist world and the big global South, including China, including India, including Arab world, including Africa, including Latin America. And on this, in this situation, Russia is in the middle of the road. And Putin is in the middle of the contradiction. He's in the middle of the political contradiction of the Russian society, and he's in the middle of the road of the world contradiction between the global West and the global South. And it's very interesting if you look even at the vocabulary, because the word global South, we have it for a long time, because the word third words appear now a little bit passé, and you know, the expression global South was invented. But what is interesting is that Russia Lavrov invented the expression global West. And you know, these people are not idiots.
No, collective West.
Or collective, yes, yeah, you're right, collective West, but sometimes global West also, but collective West. But anyway, it's the same, more or less. It's the idea. It's important, you know, to understand that they understand the world in which Russia is in the middle of the road. Russia is in the middle of world contradiction, and they know that Russia is in the middle of world contradiction, and that the Russian society is very, very, very divided. And if you look at the political situation in Russia, of course we say Putin, 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 Putin. But if you analyze, for example, you have two very important persons in Russia. I would say you have a lot of important persons like Shoigu, like Lavrov, and so on, because, you know, in Russia we have not only Putin, we have a real political elite. We can like them or don't, or hate them, but that's not the point. But we must recognize that they are very well-trained people. I mean, Lavrov is not an idiot, Shoigu is not an idiot, and most leaders of the Russian political elites are much more educated and trained than the Western political elites. But we have two very interesting people in Russia, because they are the symbol of what I told you. It's the head of the National Bank of Russia, Miss Nabiulina, and the Minister of Eurasian Integration, Glaziev, who, by the way, is an Ukrainian from Zaporozhye. And it's very important to take into account that in Russia, a Ukrainian can make career in the time when in Ukraine, if you speak Russian, you are out of the track. So it's quite interesting also to take this aspect, secondary aspect, but to take this aspect into our mind. But anyway, it's a secondary aspect. And what represent Nabiulina and what represents Glaziev? Glaziev made one interview in a Western newspaper in the United States, Cradle. This interview was made with Pepe Escobar, which is quite well known in the third world journalists. And in his interview, he's the Minister of Eurasian Integration. And he says that the war in Ukraine, more or less, if you read all his interview, more or less, it tends to show something interesting. It means that the war in Ukraine is pushing Russia to the south. We would say that it's pushing Russia to the left, because it makes the situation of Russian oligarchs, pro-Western oligarchs, worse and worse. And we had a lot of them who suicide recently. And that's very important. And we had some of them who left the countries. And which were and this exile was greeted in the Russian press. Oh, the traitors are leaving the boat. And it was rather popular in Russia to see them going out of the country, when the Western world, the Western media were showing, oh, you see, the richest Russian are leaving Russia. It's because Russia is losing the war. But in fact, for a lot of Russian, they are traitors, and it's very well they leave the ship, because it means that the ship will be more independent than it was earlier. So Glaziev, of course, more or less says that that this war is allowing a new paradigm in the world, in which Russia will be less under pressure of pro-Western oligarchs, more oriented toward China, India, south of the world, more oriented toward a state enterprise system, because all the oligarchs leaving Russia and Western enterprise leaving Russia will be nationalized. So it will reinforce the state sector. In the same time, when Glaziev says that, you had a manifestation of communists in Moscow asking for the reconstruction of socialism, because they say that under the new situation, Russia can more easily nationalize more enterprises and come back toward socialist path. So you see that there is something like an objective alliance between the, I would say, statist patriots, which are not left wings in Russia, and the communists, at least a tactic alliance. And on the other side, you have Nabiulina. And what is interesting in the Glaziev interview is that he openly criticized Nabiulina. And he says she is the leader, the director of the National Bank, and she is still loyal to the Washington Consensus, which means she's loyal to the neoliberal consensus, which means she's loyal to the Western imperialists. But as you see, she's still director of the National Bank. So I would say, in between Nabiulina and Glaziev, you have Putin. And of course, I don't know what Putin is planning. I don't know what is in the heart of Putin. I don't know if he has his own agenda on one side or the other. But anyway, he's in between. Maybe he's just wanting to stay in power. And he will go on the side of the strongest, So at certain moment it could have been Nabiulina, and other moment it can be, let's say, Glaziev, or people thinking like him, like Shoigu or other leading political people in Russia. But as I told you, it's not really important to know what Putin thinks. It's secondary. He is in the middle of a situation, and he has to decide at every moment of the political life in Russia on which of these sides he will be in favor of, and eventually what is its own interest as an individual politician. But basically, this is the situation. That's why the Ukrainian Russian war is not a war against Ukraine. Of course, partly it's a war against Ukraine, but mostly, and Glaziev told it, it's a war for a new world paradigm and for the end of the dollar power in the world. Because the ruble is now aligned to gold. The yuan, Chinese yuan, is aligned to gold. And the sanctions, and that's very important, the sanctions the West did take against Russia were planned by Russians. And for a lot of state or patriotically or communist-oriented Russian, these sanctions are very well, a very good thing, because they force to promote ruble, to promote gold, to promote yuan, to promote Indian rupee, to promote any money which is step by step emancipated from the dictatorship of the US dollar and eventually the European euro. And that's why the imperialists in the West seems to have not understood that their leadership in the world is not so strong as it was, and that the sanctions, they have some negative aspects for Russians, that's for sure. But I think that the Russians are much less dependent or influenced by sanctions than the Westerners thought. But the West will pay a lot for that. First of all, the Europeans, and in certain sense, the war between NATO and Russia, because it's also a war between NATO and Russia. It's a hybrid war, but it's a war between NATO and Russia, is also a war between United States and Europe, because it will make Europe sink. And I remember a very important anecdote that during the Maidan in 2014, Victoria Nuland, who is still very important in Washington now, told in a secret but discovered conversation with ambassador of the US, she told, fuck the EU. And the American strategy is not only to fuck Russia, it's also to fuck the EU. And they managed to do it. Because EU now will pay the price, a much higher price than Russia due to sanctions. The problem is that maybe the Americans didn't understand in their strategy against Russia, against China, against Europe, and especially against Germany, they didn't understand that the dollar will possibly, I'm not telling you that it will, but it will possibly also sink. And what is important to know about, because, you know, if you have such countries like extreme right India and extreme right Brazil, which have fascist government, but under very strong pressure, because in India we had 250 million people striking against the government last year under the communists. So we have to take that into account. Those governments didn't took the side of their American protectors in the current crisis. India and Brazil, Bolsonaro and Modi were forced or were pushed or were obliged to more or less take side of the Russians, because when India decide that the trade between Russia and India will be done in ruble or rupees, but not in dollar, it's taking side against United States dollar dictatorship. And it's very important to take into account, because of course Modi is not, he's a fascist. Of course he's a fascist. But he's not a man who can control everything. You have the national, in India, you have the Indian national bourgeoisie, which has its own interests, which are not the interest of the comprador pro-American bourgeoisie. And even a fascist like Modi must take that into account. Putin is not a fascist, but he's in his country more or less in the same situation. But if a fascist like Modi or like Brazil, Bolsonaro, have to take into account that their own national bourgeoisie pushed them to take distance toward Western, toward collective West, it means that the trend is changing, the tide is turning. And when Glaziev say that it's the time to launch a new world paradigm, that's the side he took. But that doesn't mean that all Russia is taking that side. Of course, in Russia, you had, as I told you, Nabulina. And what is interesting, whatever it pleases us or not, is that for the moment, Glaziev is still minister, and Nabulina is still the director of the National Bank. So in a certain sense, we can ask, what is doing Putin? He's the head of the states, and he didn't eliminate one of the two wings of the Russian leading class. So, we have to take that into account. It means, whatever we think about Putin, that Putin is in a position in between. And for the moment, he didn't decided to go entirely on one side. Of course, the communists of Russia are pushing in the direction of Glaziev. And the communists in Russia, it's from at least 20 to 30%, 1/3 of the Russian society at least. So it's something very important. The oligarch, the comprador bourgeoisie in Russia, it's politically speaking, it's nothing. They have, of course, influence on the economical and financial aspect, but their men, Navalny, the so-called the symbol of their trend, or even Yabloko, which is a little bit more moderate pro-Western, it's less than 10% of the society. There is no social base in Russia, electoral base for the pro-Western orientation. Even if the cultural hegemony of the West is still very powerful in Russia. But this war also allows quite a lot of Russians to look at the world in a different way. Of course, if we look, our media always says that all the Ukrainians are now pro-Western because of Russian aggression and so on and so on. I guess it's not really the case, but to a certain extent, it is. I mean, I'm sure that in Ukraine now, you are a lot more people of pro-Western orientation in Ukraine now than you had 6 months ago. But we have to observe also the situation on the other side of the front. Now we have in Russia much more people who are anti-Western than we had 6 months ago. So if we look at the situation on the world scale, maybe we have a Ukraine more and more West, but we have a Russia more and more South. So what is more important, Russia or Ukraine? Russia with 150 million inhabitants and the greatest country in the world, or Ukraine with more or less 40 million inhabitants? What is more important? especially if we take also into account, and that's why about this sanction we have to take into account. I mean, Russia pays the price of the sanctions, but the ruble didn't came back to the position it had at the beginning of the crisis. They couldn't ruin the ruble. That's one thing. The second thing, we have to take into account that Russia is exporting wheat, is exporting uranium, is exporting oil, is exporting gas, is exporting aluminium, is exporting nickel, is exporting I don't know, rare earths, is exporting cosmonautic services, is exporting arms. Russia is self-sufficient. If you blockade Russia now, maybe they will not have orange, maybe they will not have citruses, but they will have wheat, they will have bread, they will have meat, they will have everything to survive. That's not the situation of Western Europe. In Western Europe, we need gas. In Western Europe, we need oil. In Western Europe, we need wheat. Not France, but we need... in Western Europe, and including France, we need fertilizers. And fertilizers, the two countries we need for our fertilizer, among others, but we need two countries, Russia and Belarus. Because Russia and Belarus is more than 30% of world fertilizer producers in the world. So even the France produce wheat, but with Russian and Belarusian fertilizers. So what will happen next year when we will not receive Russian and Belarusian fertilizer here in France? And that's why you understand why Macron is so, concerned about finding a compromise between Russia and the West, because he's under pressure. On let's say the American party in France, as in Germany, as in Italy, as in England, is well placed in the leading state apparatus from 1945. Because we have to take into account that the European states after the World War, the Western European states after the Second World War, were either created by Americans like Western Germany or under very strong pressure of Americans like France. So the American party, I would say, the US party inside German bureaucracy, inside French bureaucracy, inside Italian bureaucracy, it means inside the army, inside the police system, the security system, the intelligence system, the judiciary system, the cultural system, the media system are very strong. And of course, they refrain policies of this state. But on the other side, you have a government which are under pressure from the society, but also pressure from economical realities. German industry cannot work without oil, without gas. Western European agriculture cannot work without Russian or Belarusian fertilizers, or sometimes without wheat, Russian or Ukrainian wheat, but mostly Russian. And all that has to be taken into account. Our media, they never talk about that. Of course, if you look at the elitary press, and the elitary media, they are conscious of that. But if you look at the TV channel, they don't talk about that. But that's the basic question. Same thing with medicine. I mean, when we had the COVID crisis in Western Europe, we began to have a shortage of medicine. Why? Because 90% of our medicine are produced in China or India. And China and India, which side they are on now in this global war? You have to you understand. I mean, China, it's very clear. I don't know if you heard the intervention last week of the foreign affairs ministers of China, who was radically criticizing Western, US domination, and asking the European to behave a little bit more independently from the United States, who will betray them earlier or later, like they did every time. It's very important, this interview, because it's not an interview, it's an intervention. It was very short, but very clear cut, taking into account that Chinese are very subtle people, and when they talk very brutally, it means that they go very far. And much more far than we are accustomed them from the kind way the Chinese are behaving normally. So we have to take all that into account. The tide is changing in the world. I don't know what will be the end of this Russian-Ukrainian war, but we have to take into account that it's a world war. But it's of course a hybrid war, because it was theorized at the beginning of the 2000 years. You had in China a book written by three generals of the army general, who wrote that the new war in the world, the new world war, will not be a military one, but will be a hybrid war, because of the new arms that are making a world war in the classic style, like the First and the Second World War, impossible. And that the hybrid war will be a war which is partly military, partly political, partly psychological, partly financial, partly economical. And this book, of course, was translated in the United States for the Pentagon. And you understand that the American high military command, they are not stupid there. In the Pentagon, they are not stupid. In the CIA, they are more stupid, but in the Pentagon, they are not stupid. And the Pentagon general, they don't want war. They know that a war is impossible, and that if a world war, military war is launched, everybody will lose. So they are much more clever. They are not our guys, but they are still intelligent and realistic. And they understand that the politicians of Western Europe and United States are not understanding basic facts in the world situation. They do understand what is their situation. That's why they behaved in a very rational way when there was the possibility of war between Iran and United States. Now we don't talk a lot about Iran. But Iran is also a country which is very important economically, financially, and militarily. Iran is allied, of course, with China and Russia, and its role is not as important as China and Russia, but regionally speaking, it's a country which is more and more important. And which has a political system, we can like its system or not, but which have with Russia and China something in common, that they have historical roots. So they see the importance of the future, taking into account the historical background, and they have a view in which it's not only important what will be done in the next 6 months, as are doing our politicians, but for Iranians, like Chinese, like Russian, it's very important what will be done in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. Because they have a large view, but their political system allowed them to have this large view. When you have a one-party system like in China, you have a system in which the party wants to behave to have the power for a long time, and they have to take into account not only the next 6 months but the next 60 years. And that's the same thing in Iran, because you have also a political system which is quite similar to the one-party system, even if they have different something like parties in Iran, but they have something like a one-party system. And in Russia, of course, they have no one-party system, but from the Soviet times, they still have something like a state apparatus, which is which is divided in different fractions, but which is more working on the base of consensus than on the base of I take your job, you take my job, like in the so-called Western democracies, when the main goal of politicians now is to be elected for 4 years, make money, and then go to the administrative board of the company where you will have more money. And in the Western world, what it means, because we had the deindustrialization and the delocalization, which are the big companies still in place in United States, in France, military sector. So it means that if you are a politician in United States, you need to be elected taking the money from the military complex. You are elected, and then when you are elected, you push the interests of the military sector, which is not the Pentagon. The military sector is the producer, the arm producer, the capitalist producing arms. It means that their interest is to have more and more wars. You help them to make money in different wars, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Syria, in Iraq, in Ukraine, wherever you want, or in South Sudan, in Eastern Congo, in Colombia, and so on, with narco traffics and everywhere you want. And if you have helped them to make money in different wars or hybrid war, after you are offered a place at the administrative board of the company, where you will have more money. And that's why I would say United States, and to a certain extent some Western European countries, if we want to have an historical analogy, it's the analogy with Prussia. As we know, in the 18th century, one French thinker defined Prussia as not a state having an army, but an army having a state. And the history of the 19th and 20th century up to the end of the Second World War proves he was right. Prussia was an army possessing the state. But now United States are a military industrial complex possessing the state. Like Israel is the same situation. Israel is also a new Prussia in the Middle East. It's a military complex which have a territorial base, going from war to war, because it makes a bourgeoisie living on wars. Russia, China, India, Brazil, whatever we think about their government, are a much more multilateral economy. Because, as I told you, of course, Russia is producing arms and is making trade with arms. But Russia is exporting wheat. Russia is exporting oil. Russia is exporting a lot of things which have nothing to do with armament. That's the same for China. That's the same for India. That's the same for Brazil. And of course, Modi, Bolsonaro, or Putin are not our guys, politically speaking. But they have to take into account that they have a productive economy, and that the interest of their productive economy is not war, is development. United States economy is a war economy. And that's the basic difference. And the problem is Western Europe, because in Western Europe, we have a strong trend which is not interested by war, but the state bureaucracy are completely linked from 1945 with the American interests. It's a mafia-like system in which every political leader begins his career being a young American leader. We have to see that Poles, young Pole, young German, young French, young English, young Italian, they are picked up at the university, offered training in the United States under the so-called Young Leader programs, and sent back to their country, working in their country in the interest of the American imperialism. Young leaders are the base of the political class in all EU countries. It was the same in Ukraine, and it was the same in Russia up to Putin. Putin, as I told you, it was a compromise. You have Russian young leaders, but now they are not in the leading position as they were. But the strategy of the American all over the world is to manipulate the so-called young leaders. They train in the United States and they send back in their countries, like in the colonial times, like the French and the British did, or the German did in their colony, creating a comprador elite trained in the metropole and sent back to the country to serve the interests of the empire. And of course, it's not a hazard that if in Poland or in France, you will never do a PhD at the university about young leaders, because you will never be accepted. Because if you work on that field, you will show things we have not to know about. That's the Western democracy. You can talk what you want, you can work on about what you want, but you have certain subjects you cannot really talk about. Or if you do it, you will never emerge, and you will never be invited, and you will never be published. Or you will be pushed in a little ghetto, like the Jews were put in ghettos in Middle Age Europe. We are pushed in a ghetto. We can talk freely among the 5% of the population, but the 95% of the population cannot know about us, especially if we have information. I can talk because I'm 66 and I don't care what they will think about me, because if they get me out of my university, it's not a catastrophe for me. But think about people who has 20 years, who is 20-year-old, and who wants to make career in his country, which is legitimate. He will never make now. It's impossible now to make career as 30 years ago, having a dissident opinion. Is very, very difficult. That's why young people taking the side of real left, because real left is not the pseudo societal left, LGBT and so on. Of course, I'm not against LGBT, but the slogan of LGBT and so on are a way of penetration of real left by the pseudo left. It's of course a manipulation, using LGBT or anti-racism and so on to neutralize class left, including LGBT people from lower classes. Which has of course right to behave the way they want, but it's not a central point. And why I'm talking about that, it's because the class left, if you choose to live along in the interest of the working class, now you will never have the opportunity you had 40 years ago when I began my career. Because when I began my career, we were at the time when there was socialist camp, Western camp, strong communist party in the West, or Marxist party in the West, and they had to accept some form of pluralism. But now it's over. There is no more pluralism possible in Western countries. When we talk about repression of free press in Russia, I know that the situation of the media in Russia is not a paradise one, but it's not different in the West. There is no difference. We are living now in a dictatorship. They decided we cannot look at RT, Russia Today, just the way that the Russian government decided that Echo Moskvy will be repressed. That's the same thing. No difference. No difference at all. The only difference is that inside the media of Russia, the pro-government media in Russia, you have just more intelligent people than in a lot of Western media. So when you looked at Russian propaganda, it's propaganda, but the Russian propaganda is more intelligent than the one we have here. Because the one we have here is repeating all the time the same thing. So people are fed up quite easily, but most of them resign from politics because they understand that the system is too strong to fight against, but they don't believe anymore to what happens in television. They know, most people, in France, but in Poland, I guess it's the same. People say TV is a band of liars. People know that TV is liars. They are all liars. People know. But what they do, they don't take the street because they think the system is too strong and we will crush them. In Russia, maybe it's more or less the same, but the difference is that when you have an interview with Lavrov, you have an interview with at least an intelligent man, which has nothing to do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany, of Britain, of France, of the United States. Compare the intelligence of Blinken with the intelligence of Lavrov. No, Blinken is an idiot. That's all. Lavrov, you can hate him, but he's not an idiot. He can talk about everything. I will give you an anecdote that has nothing to do with Russia and nothing to do with Western world, and has something to do with Syria. I was in Syria long before the war, in 2006. I was in the commission examining the situation in Syria. And I was with a couple of French professors, and we were received by Bashar al-Assad. The bad guy, the terrorist, the bad guy, the wrong one, the very bad guy. But at that time, he was bad, but not so bad because it was before the war. And I went there, and we had a conversation that was supposed to be 1 hour. We had a conversation. We were about 5 people or 6 people, and we had to be more or less 1 hour, and of course to discuss about politics. And the first thing what was interesting, that his translator was the director of the Damascus Opera. The director of the Damascus Opera, who made study of music in Lyon, France. So that's interesting. And we had this conversation, and we talked about everything. We talked about philosophy, about art, about culture. Because, Bashar al-Assad, he wanted to talk about that. And, the minutes were going and going and going. And after 1 hour, we looked at our clock, and he noticed that we looked at our clock because we were just surprised. And he told us, "Oh, I had 1 hour to talk with you, but I don't care. I don't care. I go on and I want to talk with you more because, politics is so uninteresting now that when I'm meeting in the world leaders, they are so uninteresting. not knowing anything about art, about philosophy, about culture, that when I'm with you, I have to talk to somebody who are having a discussion I want to have, and I cannot have it with all the world leaders, because the political class in the world is so uninteresting now that for me it's a liberation. I can talk with you about all this subject, forgetting about politics. At the end, we talked about politics, but that's the basic difference. I mean, Bashar al-Assad, you can think whatever you want about him, but it's one of the best man in the world on the level of culture. He knows paintings, he knows music, he knows philosophy, he knows medicine because he was student of medicine. He knows, he's a top man, intellectually speaking. Maybe he's a bad one or a good one, it's another thing. But anyway, he's an intelligent man, cultured man. Now in the world, if you look at all political leaders in the world, you cannot say Russian leaders are top, Syrian leaders are top, Iranian leaders are top, Chinese leaders are top. Outside of that, most of them there are just idiots. When you see Van der Leyen, when you see Macron, when you see Johnson, when you see Draghi, when you see Blinken, when you see Biden, oh my God. Oh, they have nothing in their head. They are just, a puppet of the intelligent bourgeoisie, because bourgeoisie is intelligent. But a good bourgeois now knows that his career is not in politics, because politicians are just puppets. The real leaders are outside politics now in the capitalist world. The real leaders are in the banks. They are not world politician leaders. And that we have to take into account. That's the proof that the Western system and that the Western bourgeoisie is a decaying one. I'm not sure what will happen in the world. I hope that we will have a world revolution, but I'm sure that the Western world is finishing. And we have then two solutions, the one Rosa Luxemburg told us about, socialism or barbarism. And that's the point. And not taking side with Putin's Russia, because it's not my, my political orientation. I observe that this country has some potentials we lost in the West. And that's all.
Okay, so thank you, Bruno. I want to say two things. Firstly, you didn't answer my question about the political views of Putin.
I don't know.
Yes. You make a Marxist analysis, and it was good because you said simply that the Putin is I don't know, synthesis of the economic situation. What?
Rather a compromise than
yes, compromise. And what he is putting in his head, it is not important. But because of the last 2 months, everybody talk every day, 24 hours about Putin. Even if it is not important, I would like to ask you what.
But I will tell you that I don't really know, because Putin is able to make a discourse which is completely neo-Tsarist, nationalistic. And in another time, he will make a discourse which is much more liberal. And in another time, he will make a discourse which is almost communist. So when is the real Putin? I don't know. I think he knows he's a realistic, that's for sure, he's a realistic man. He knows that in Russia and in the whole world, you have trends. he has to take into account. And that those trends, I would say, but that's my hypothesis, he respects them. Because he looks like a man taking into account facts. He's a good chess player, and he takes into account facts. And facts are respectful. So the communist fact is respectful. The Orthodox faith is respectful. The Islam is respectful. The liberalism as an ideology is respectful. And he respects all that because it's fact. And I would say that, like most Russian, Russia is a highly, we could say, mystical country. And when I'm saying mystical, the mysticism doesn't always mean religious in the sense that you have to believe in God. Of course, you can be mystical believing in God, but you can be mystical being a Marxist. It means that you have the feeling that there are higher values than your own interest. That you have values which are living for centuries, and that you will dedicate your life for that. And that's mysticism. And because of a very long tradition, maybe coming from Orthodox Church, why not? I don't care from which it's coming. But anyway, Russia was always a very strongly mystical country and mystical culture. And that's why they created mysticism inside orthodoxy. That's why the Russian Islam, because there is a Russian Islam, Russia is one of the most Islamic countries in Europe after Bosnia and Turkey. And Albania. So you have a mystical tradition of Islam in Russia, and you have a tradition of cohabitation between those two. You have also the Jewish mystical tradition, which was linked with, integrated to Russia when Russia did conquer Ukraine and Belarus. And you have even a mystical Buddhist tradition in Eastern Russia, in Buryatia and Kalmykia. And you have a mystical communism, because the Russian communism was much more mystical than the, let's say, the Western European communism. You cannot understand the Battle of Stalingrad if you don't take into aspect the mystical aspect of Red Army and of the Russian communism or the Soviet communism. So there is something, and of course, whatever Putin is, he's a son of that mysticism. So that's the reason why I'm quite convinced he respects all mysticism. It means he respects all political trends which have long-term views. And when people having these long-term views are able to work for them and even sacrifice for them. That's I'm quite sure about him. That's the only point. Now, which mysticism he's linked with, or maybe he's just a patchwork mystic, which can be sometime a little bit Soviet, sometime a little bit Tsarist, sometime a little bit liberal, I don't know. But he's taking all these elements into account, because all the political elite in Russia are linked with that. And that's why, Russian, you have anti-communist in Russia, but apart from what they call the Zapadnik, it means the completely Western-oriented Russian intellectuals or careerists, the mass of the people in Russia, including anti-communists, even hardline anti-communists, they respect communists. They don't like communism, but they respect communism. Because they know, that the Russian communists sacrificed a lot of their time, of their life, for what they were believing in. And because of that, they, the Russian anti-communists will not be primitive anti-communists as are the Western anti-communists. Like, on the other side, if you look at Zyuganov, he will never talk about Orthodox Church or Islamic religion the way a French laicist is talking about religion. He respects. I will finish with an anecdote. I remember I was in Soviet Union in 1975, and I was near Pskov in a monastery. And, I was with a group of tourists coming from Poland, but an Orbis, group. But in this group, we had a lot of American students from Polish origin who were studying in Krakow. So we had a lot of American, and I'm in this group. And we went to this monastery, and the group leader, the intourist guide, was 100% communist. 100%, completely loyal to the Soviet state, to the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and so on and so on. And we had time to talk with him a lot of time because we were in Leningrad, we were in Pskov, we were here and there. So we had, we had time to discuss about West, East, Marxism, capitalism, and so on. He was an intelligent man. And I remember that when we went into this monastery, at a certain moment he comes to me, and we talked already. So he was he thought that I would react interestingly according to him. So he came to me and he told me, "Look at those Americans. They are inside the church. They just behave like if they were in the supermarket. They don't make the difference between supermarket and church. They have they don't know what is respect for somebody's belief. I'm an atheist, but in this church, I behave the way not to shock believers coming here, because I'm not in a supermarket. I'm in their church. You have monks, you have believers, you have people you have to respect. Look at they shout, they look at things, they make photos like if they were in the supermarket. That's the American culture, but it's no culture. That's that's why the reaction of a Marxist-Leninist atheist in a Russian church in 1975, and that makes me understand what means the Russian mysticism, because I had exactly the same anecdote to say. The next day we were in Leningrad, and we were in the Petropavlov fortress, where people were jailed under the Tsarist time. Communists, Bolsheviks, Varinsky, and so on. And it was something like the Temple of Revolution. And exactly the same thing happened. We were in the jail, and the guide of the prison told, she was a lady, and she told, behave with silence here, because here people were martyrized for their ideas. You have or not the same opinion, but you have to respect. And the same thing happened. They behaved there like if they were in the supermarket. And that Russian guide, she looked at them like at barbarians. And the guide the day before in the monastery, the Marxist-Leninist one came to me and said, "Oh, they are terrible. They are equally barbarian in a church like they are here in the temple of communism." You know, that's the Russian mysticism, and that make I understand that, and I'm sure Putin is a man coming from that culture. So to a certain extent, of course, I don't know what he's believing in. Maybe he's a pure careerist, but anyway, he knows that he has to respect other people's beliefs. That doesn't mean that he's not authoritarian. That doesn't mean that he's really respecting, for example, let's say Ukrainian culture, because what he told about Ukrainian culture is a little bit ethnocentric, according to me. Maybe the Ukrainian culture is not as developed as the Russian one, but still it allows some respect. He didn't show when he says that the Ukrainian language is not a real one and the Ukrainian are Russian. No, the Ukrainians are not Russians. Of course, they have strong link with Russian culture, but there is something like Ukraine, and we have to understand that. And he doesn't look that he really understands that. But you know, that's an aspect of his intervention I didn't really enjoy. Because that's what Lenin called the great Russian chauvinism. It exists. I mean, we have to take that into account, that there is something like the great Russian chauvinism. Or I would rather now call it the great Russian ethnocentrism. And it's of course much more much worse when your ethnocentrism is an ethnocentrism of great nation than an ethnocentrism of little nation. I mean, you know, the Macedonian ethnocentrism is not really dangerous. Is not really unsympathetic. We can laugh about it, but the ethnocentrism of big nations is worst, including Polish ethnocentrism, because the problem of Poles is that they still behave a lot of time like if they were a big nation. They don't understand that they are not anymore a big nation, so they don't behave like little nation and ethnocentrism. They behave like big nation ethnocentrism, not having the tools of big nation, and it makes them ridiculous. And that's why they are treated. And I would like Poles to be aware of that. That I love Polish culture. I'm partly Polish, and I really, it pains me when I see nowadays Poland, because it's betraying everything which is positive in the Polish culture, because now the Poles are behaving in a way people laugh at them in the East and in the West. In the East, because they are treated like a puppet of the West, but in the West it's the same. I mean, the American and the French and the German are looking at Poles like at servants who are behaving the way Malcolm X told about the house Negroes. You know, the slaves licking the feet of the master. And that's, you know, it pains me. It pains me very when I look at Polish political scene and I see this behavior, because I know that in the West and in the East, they are looking, you know, at Poles like nothing, because, you know, Poles think they are a big nation and they are not anymore a big nation, but they don't accept they are a little nation. But they are a little nation.
Here is the photo of Putin with Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
Yes, and my question is that one of the explication of the war which is now in Ukraine, it is that Putin wanted to make a denazification of Ukraine,
Yeah.
and the problem of Ukraine was of destroying of the monument of the Soviet army.
Yeah.
But this guy Solzhenitsyn, we can also say that he is
Yeah.
a Russian Nazi. He supported Pinochet. He
Yeah.
supported Franco. He make a glorified a Russian fascist from the Vlasov army.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how it is how Putin he in one side he is against Nazis in Ukraine, but he supports Russian Nazi Solzhenitsyn.
I don't know. I think that I would say that it's maybe for pure opportunism, because Solzhenitsyn at that time was a good card you could use in the West, and for sure at the beginning of his career as president of Russia, I'm convinced that Putin believed in the fact that Russia can be integrated to the Western Bloc as a, let's say, secondary power. And that was the strategy of Putin. When he discovered that the Western world will not accept any Russia, any form of Russia, then he was obliged to change its way. But at the beginning, Solzhenitsyn was a good element, a good tool to understand the West, because Solzhenitsyn was in the West, and Solzhenitsyn explained to him that he was also deceived by the West. So they had something in common. But of course, as you know, I would say there is something like opportunism in Putin's behavior. I don't know what he's believing in, but of course there is something like opportunism, and I think that he was able to try at a certain moment to rehabilitate Vlasov army. Now it's over, because it's not anymore the time. He has to be thankful to the Red Army. But at that time, it was a possibility that you use the Vlasov army legitimacy to place yourself in the West. But not as a tiny power, but as a secondary power within the American empire. This place was forbidden for Russians, and then, of course, he has to retreat, I would say, toward the south. We have to understand one thing for the Putin's generation, not only Putin. Those people, whatever their evolution was a tragic evolution, because they were born in Soviet Union, educated within the frame of Soviet, let's say, the Soviet frame. They believed, or not entirely, but it was something stable, defined. And then they had, whatever we think about it, they had this terrible shock of the end of perestroika and the destruction of Soviet Union. And now, and from one day to another, the things which looked stable were destroyed. And they were like orphans. And then they had to rebuild something. And they were looking, pragmatically, nationalism, orthodoxy, religion, Western Europe, China, this, that, and they didn't really knew how to behave. So they picked things from different directions, and it created the Russian patchwork we have now. Of course, but even the communists were quite destabilized in the 90s. When you look at the Communist Party documents in the 90s, concerning things like Tsar, like orthodoxy, like nation, you had some aspects which were, not very, very far from the, let's say, hard right-wing nationalism. Even Jewish things, When you had this in the Communist Party, you had some critics of the cosmopolitanism, which were looking quite anti-Semitic. So you have to understand that this was a big shock in a society, I told you, where the life expectancy was reduced about 10 years. So you had the shock, the ideological, the intellectual shock, the psychological shock, and you had the material, very, very basic shock. And it makes people very destabilized. But in spite of that, you had the situation that what is astonishing is that the Russian energy is really strong. I mean, a lot of countries would have disappeared in this situation. Russia did not. But Russia is now on the path of reconstructing something out of this patchwork. I don't know if this reconstruction is going in the right direction or not. I don't know if the Ukrainian war, apart from the tragedy of the war in itself, because it's tragedy, will be an element that will help Russia to understand a lot of reality of the world or not. But anyway, we have to understand that Russia has the tragic history for the last 30 years. And Putin is a man from that society and from that generation. So, that we have to take into account also. I don't want to justify every decision that he takes, but I want to make you understand that in this patchwork, it's very difficult to have a balanced view of the reality. So that he's quite unbalanced sometimes. Maybe he plays out of it, but it's not easy anyway.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions, but it's already more than 1 hour 50 minutes. But I want to anchor two questions. First thing is, you said about the Western countries and the politician who are thinking only to make a second job after to be politician, to be to work to the military industrial complex. So yes, so in last week we have a very scandalous information from Poland that Poland is the champion of the sending weapon to Ukraine. Poland sent to 200 Polish tanks from the Soviet times to Ukraine. Do you think that the politician who decided this, they were corrupted by the American military complex? And second thing which I want to ask is totally different question. What do you think about the situation in the island of Solomon Island, and the hypocrisy of the Western countries?
Yes, first question, I do think that I'm not sure, of course, but I think that the Polish higher class is very largely corrupt, but not in the sense of a Western elite, which are corrupt inside a balanced system, whereas I told you, people making political career, they will be promoted politically, and then they can go to the private sector, and it's done in a quote civilized way. Poland is a colony. Poland is a third world country. As all Eastern Europe, we have to understand that there is no difference between Poland and Burundi. And when I'm talking that, I just want to pay my tribute to a former Polish right wing, but still very good police economist, which is Witold Kieziun, who worked in Burundi and who worked in Poland, and who, before passing away, he was comparing how Burundi and Poland became the same style of country with the same style of political class. It means a completely colonial class. I know that a lot of Poles, comparing Burundi with Poland, it's a scandal, but not. Poland is the Burundi of Europe. With all the respect I have to Burundians. But the problem is that Burundians, they understand they have a neo-colonial situation. Poles do not. But Poland is a colony. So when people in Poland are taking such decisions, they are taking decisions, just thinking that their master will give them a piece of bread because of that. They even are not paid as a normal corrupt people. They are just paid a little bit. And this is sufficient to make them puppets, to make them servants, to make them house Negroes. They are house Negroes. The house Negro knows that he will never be the master. But still, he's working for his masters. And when, as Malcolm X told, when the house of the master is burning, and when field Negroes are happy because the house of the master is burning, he will bring water so the house will not burn. And because of that, he will have 3 more potatoes in his plates. And for him, it's sufficient. And the Polish leading class, they just want the master to give them 3 more potatoes in the plate. They are not even thinking about to become a master. They use the Polish chauvinism against Russia, but they are mostly using it against Ukraine and Belarus, because all the hypocrisy of the Polish pro-Ukrainian feelings now is linked with the fact that they think that Ukraine will become a Polish colony, thanking Poland for what it gives them. They don't understand that Ukrainian nationalists, they detest Poland and they don't need Poland. They use Poland. Because if they want to have somebody helping them from the West, they will think about Germany or United States. They don't need Poland. So when you hear Kaczynski telling that there will be a Polish-Ukrainian strategical alliance, it's bullshit. Because Ukrainian, they will take the tanks. But if they win the war, what I think they will lose, but that's another thing. Admitting they win the war, the first thing they will do after the war is to go to Berlin and Washington. They will never go to Warsaw. And Polish political class is thinking that since they behave to the American as house Negro, the Ukrainians will behave as house Negroes of the Poles. That's bullshit. That's pure bullshit. If the Ukrainians want to be house Negroes, they will be the house Negroes of the Germans or the American capitalists, not the Polish capitalists, because there is no such thing like Polish capitalist. There is Polish comprador bourgeoisie, but who in Poland is a capitalist able to be competitive with big multinational enterprise of the Western world? Give me one example. There is no one example. We have in Poland comprador bourgeoisie, and some little entrepreneurs dreaming to become something like a national bourgeoisie. And they are helping the Peace Party because of his nationalist pseudo ideology. Dreaming that they will Kaczynski will open the way to a national Polish economy, which is not the case. Orban is more clever. I don't like Orban, but at least he understands that. But in the Polish political class, it's more stupid than the Hungarian ones, because the Hungarian nationalists, at least they understand what means national interests, and that if you want to promote national interests, you have to look at the world map. And Orban discovered that if he is only the house Negro of the American and German, he will never build a Hungarian nationalist economy. So he needs Erdogan and he needs Putin. And because he has good contact with Putin and Erdogan, when he goes to Washington, or when he goes to Brussels, or when he goes to Berlin, they don't like him, but they respect him. But nobody respects Duda. I mean, that's just how Negroes.
There is a comment here. Prof. Bruno is a giant Marxist intellect. Thanks, comrade, for having him here. And before was excellent take by Professor Bruno, as always. The last
Solomon Island.
Yes. The
Solomon very
Island.
interesting. I would be the president of the Solomon Island now. I would be very, very, very aware that I guess that he will not live long, because what he did with the Chinese, deciding that the Solomon Islands are an independent state, because of course on the paper there is an independent state, and that the Chinese Navy can come to the Solomon Island, is a very courageous but maybe suicidal path. Of course, it reveals that the president of Solomon Islands is conscious that the tide is changing. But it can take some time, and I hope that before that he created a very good secret police in Solomon Island, but a very good one, able to compete with the Australian and the American secret police. I doubt he was able to build such a secret police. So I think that he will be either murdered, or that you will have in a couple of days or months a colored revolution in Solomon Islands.
But Bruno, is written here in Wikipedia that the state, or the head of the state is the Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah, formally, yeah. Still, it's of course because it's the Commonwealth. But I know when I say president for the prime minister, the prime minister of Solomon Islands. But still, I mean, it's a formal belonging to the Commonwealth. In fact, legally, Solomon Islands are independent, but you see, they're in the traditional area of influence of Australia working for United States. So they have two masters in Solomon Islands. They have Australians working for the Americans, and now he's looking for the Chinese. So maybe the Chinese Gongganju, which means the Chinese state police, trained in a very, 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 very rapid, speedy way, Solomon Island state police able to make Solomon Island prime minister survive any color revolution or any attempt of murdering, but still I doubt. So for me, it's a very courageous man, but I don't know he will last. If he will last long, because you saw last month that the American managed to kick out of power Imran Khan in Pakistan, who was much more powerful, and who showed after he was ousted that he has a huge support in mass manifestations all over Pakistan. But still, the American did manage to oust him. And Pakistan is a big country. So with all the respect I have with the Solomon Island nation and people and government, I really doubt they can manage to to stand up in front of United States and Australia. But still, I would like for Poland to have a political class which behave the way field Negroes of the Solomon Islands behave. I would like to have at the head of Poland a Solomon Island prime minister. If they kick him out from Solomon Island in a color revolution, I hope that he will come to Poland and take power in Warsaw, because Poland will be a much freer country with a Solomon Island premier than with the Duda, Kaczynski, Tusk, and other Morawiecki and other leaders.
There is a question for you. It is true that the Communist Party of the Russian Federation keeps growing in support and influence. It is possible that they could come to power in Russia. And second part of question, it is the KPRF even Marxist, or are they social democrat?
Yeah, the first question, I mean, according to observers, officially Communist Party at the last election had 20% of the vote. But most observers consider that in fact they had more or less something between 20 and 30%. Because we all know that the results of the election in Russia are not really objective. So we can say that the communists for the moment in Russia have, taking into account the CPRF or the KPRF and other communist groups, which are not so big as the KPRF, we can say that more or less 1/3 of the Russians are on the communist side. When I say are on the communist side, it means are clearly on the communist side. And the 2/3 rest are in between, more communist or more anti-communist, but communist is still in Russia a very strong idea. The problem, of course, of Russian communists is that they know that for the moment the class situation in Russia does not allow them to conquer the power, that they have to be in an alliance, a difficult alliance. It means that they have more or less to support all in anti-imperialist trends within the Russian, let's say, establishment. In the same time, they know that they have strong enemies, and they have also strong differences. So that's the point. The communists in Russia thinks that now they can push toward more nationalization of the economy, and they can push in the direction of a more of an economy which will be nearer to socialism as a step toward a renewed socialism in the long run. That's the situation. So I don't know what will happen, but for the moment, it is impossible to communists, even if they would have win the election, the Russian establishment will not allow them to win the election. That's one thing. The other question is a good question, because in fact the KPRF is divided in different orientations, from the social democracy up to the, I would say, far left. And inside the Communist Party, you have very strong differences. Even we can say that it's a miracle that this party didn't split, especially in the 90s. So it didn't split, but we have very strong differences. I would say that the main trend, the Zyuganov trend of inside the party, is more or less, I would say, Chinese communist oriented. I mean, the cooperation between the KPRF and the CPC is very strong, especially in the formation and in the Marxist training, which is more or less in the line of Xi Jinping. That's the let's say the strongest line in the CPRF. But you have a social democrat wings in the party, and you have also more, I would say, leftists inside the party. So in that sense, we can say that the KPRF is not a typical Bolshevik party with a very strong ideological unity and strong administrative unity. But what is interesting is that you have a lot of different Marxist group in Russia, which are on the left of the Communist Party, and they are useful because they push the Communist Party in the left and not in the right. But of course, everything can happen. So I would not say the KPRF is social democrat on the long term, because their main goal is still communism, and we observe that now, because they are organizing different exhibition, manifestation, tending to force to the nationalization of every enterprise that has been left by foreign capital or by oligarchs who left Russia. So the idea that the public sector has to be reinforced is something important if we compare with Western social democracy, where private property is a cult in the socialist and social democrat party. So the ideology of that the free market will help, and that private enterprise are better than public ones, is an ideology that is a little bit passé in Russia, all over Russia, and especially among communists.
And you think the Western elites more than hate Putin or the Russian communists?
Of course, they hate more Russian communists than Putin. I don't even know if they really hate Putin. They don't like Russia as a state. They do not like Russia as a state because they know that potentially Russia will be an independent country. An independent country tending towards socialism, because socialism has strong roots in Russia. But even if not tending towards socialism, they will tend toward a competitive capitalism with the West, and they cannot accept that. But we have to understand that Russia is only one enemy of the West. The main enemy is still China. But they decided that they will eliminate Russia and then China. You had, in competition within the neoconservative in United States up to now, that do the United States are first to attack China or Russia? Obviously, they decided it's better to begin with Russia, but then China.
There is a comment. The right to property is a fundamental human right. What are you saying is not a Marxist point? It is Proudhon's property is theft versus property is a right.
The property is theft, of course, but we have, of course, to look what we think about property. Every form of property which is functioning of the base of the exploitation is a theft. When you are a capitalist using working people, you are taking out of their working force some money, so you exploit them, and it means it's theft. But in the same time, the little capitalist can be under pressure of bigger capitalists. So in the class struggle, it can happen that the little capitalist can be on the side of the masses against the big capitalists. It can happen, but basically, of course, every capitalist will be opportunistic. Now you have the individual property, and the problem of property is that we don't really make the difference sometimes between capitalist private property and individual property. If you have, let's say, a field where you work by yourself, produced by yourself, not exploiting anybody, maybe on the economical analysis, it's a waste, because the little property will never give a lot of opportunity for the development of the economy. But you don't exploit people. This property cannot be considered as a property exploiting people. It's not the same thing like when you are you have a property exploiting people. But now we are in a much worse situation than we were before, because earlier we had capitalists who were owners of fabrics, of industry, exploiting their workers. But now we have, how do we say in English, actioneers. I don't remember. Akcjonariusze in Polish. And, they go from one enterprise to another. They are exploiting people, but they change the people they exploit. They can change 3 times in one day, because they can buy in the morning some action, sell them at noon.
Shareholders,
yeah. So they are nomadic capitalists. At least the former capitalists were interested to preserve their instrument of exploitation, but still to save their instrument of exploitation. Now it's much worse, because they can go from one to another. As soon as it doesn't give them 15% of benefits, they sell the enterprise and the working force of the enterprise, and they go to another way. So they are much more predatory than the worst capitalists we had in the 19th and the beginning of 20th centuries. So we have a degenerate capitalism, which is much worse than the capitalism we had earlier, which was not good, but still had something previsible, something that we could plan, and sometime we had interest in common. You see it in Germany. Why would you see it in Germany? Because Germany is the only country in Europe where you have still a national industry. Germany is the only country in Europe which didn't deindustrialize, partly at least. And because of that, you have a very strong contradiction in Germany between the ones who are defending German industry and the ones who are defending the financial supranational economy. And it's very interesting during that Ukrainian war. We have an objective alliance in Germany between capitalist industrialists, and trade unions. Both work together to push Germany to have good relation with Russia, because they are all based on local industry. They want to defend, of course, that the German capitalist exploits its workers, but the German workers understand that this industry doesn't has to disappear. So the trade union, whatever we think about the German trade union, but the trade union in Germany understood they have to defend this industrialist capitalists in Germany, and to defend an open policy toward Russia and towards Russian markets and towards Eurasian integration and so on, because if not, this enterprise will be destroyed. So that's the difference we have in Russia, in Germany, between the national capitalists allied with the trade unions against the comprador capitalists, which are linked with Euro-Atlantic interests and bureaucracies.
I wanted to finish, but there is one more question. What are the professor's views on the former Deutsche German Democratic Republic?
Oh, it's another issue, but I think now, German Democratic Republic was in a very difficult situation because, of course, it was the poorest part of Germany from the very beginning. So it was poorest, and it was the part of Germany where socialism had to be built under very strong pressure from the richer part of Germany. So we have to take into account that the situation of GDR was from the very beginning very, very difficult. The second thing, and that's the positive aspect of German Democratic Republic, since the German Democratic Republic couldn't be a nation state like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like Hungary, because it was only a part of the nation, of the German nation. It couldn't really carry on a nationalistic policy, and that it had to be a much more ideological state, because the reason of existence of GDR was socialism. The reason of existence of People's Poland or People's Hungary was socialism, but it could be only Poland. And that's why the Polish United Workers' Party promoted a patriotical propaganda. You couldn't put that in Eastern Germany because there was no such thing like an East German nation. And especially in a situation where German nationalism was completely delegitimized by Hitlerism. So for that reason, of course, German Democratic Republic was much more socialist than other socialist country of Europe, and that's the reason why they were much more consequent in their behavior, but in a situation where they had two problems. One problem is the fact that, as I told you, they were the poorest part of Germany competing with the richer part, which created also, among others, the Berlin Wall. But they had another problem. It's that they were building socialism except for Saxonia, the southern part of GDR, and except for Berlin as a city, they were building socialism in the most reactionary part of Germany, because Brandenburg, Mecklenburg, Thuringia were much more right-wing, much more conservative, much more Prussian-oriented than, let's say, Cologne, Rhineland, Hamburg, Lower Saxonia, and so on. So, to use a Stalinist expression, the human material the East German leader had based on was quite reactionary at the very beginning. Of course, in the situation of a complete delegitimation of any state institution in Germany after the defeat of Nazism, the people in all Eastern Germany, like in all Germany, was completely disoriented. And they don't really knew what they had to do. And in this situation, it was quite easy for the communists to organize them and push them in one direction, but still it had to be done in an authoritarian way because the human product in let's say Brandenburg was basically reactionary. So you had to push them to shout slogans, socialist slogans, but it didn't came from from inside, except, as I told you, for Saxony, part of Saxony, and Berlin city, which had strong leftist traditions. And it's observable because when you look at the career of most East German leaders, a lot of them were coming from Saxony or Berlin. Apart from Honecker, who was coming from Western Germany, but from Saarland, which is a working class area in Western Germany. So it's interesting. I mean, you had much more Saxonian or Berliners at the top of the German party than you had Mecklenburgians or Brandenburgians. Because the Prussian old tradition, still functioned. So that's the two problems they had: the grassroots reactionary habits of the main part of Eastern Germany, and the competitiveness of Western Germany, of richer Germany, and the pressure coming from richer Germany, especially if you take into account that the capital of GDR was the same city as the West Berlin, which was on the other side. Of course, the building of the Berlin Wall solved to a certain extent the problem, but just only to a certain extent, because you had most of the time West Berliners coming regularly to East Berlin, because you had just to you could look at the West Berlin TV or radio all the times, and you were quite easily in GDR under the cultural hegemony of the Western Germany. East German, except for old people, couldn't really travel to West Germany, but they were under West Germany television and radio influence all the time. So in fact, they were linked with West Germany all the time. And they were under pressure. I know quite well East Germany, because when I was in Poland, I was, in the student union in charge of foreign students at the Krakow city socialist student union. And of course, I had a very strong relation with students from all over the world, but especially from socialist country and especially from GDR. So I knew them very well. And I went to GDR also, and I saw them also in Berlin, East Berlin, of course. So I understand, the student I was in contact with were all communists, but they were under very strong pressures, and they felt they are always under strong pressures. And it was not really easy for them, psychologically speaking, because another anecdote I will tell you. I remember it was just before the Easter holidays, and I had the Polish consular passport, and having the Polish consular passport, I could travel easily in the east and the west. So I I was in the canteen, and I went, eat with one East German girl and one Polish girl, and it was just before the Easter holidays. And the East German girl I was with then, she was very strong communist, father from communist tradition. She was Marxist, Leninist, and everything was fine. But she asked me, "What are you doing for Easter?" Because I'm going back to Berlin, and what are you doing? And I told her, I answered her, "Oh, I have to go to Paris. It's a long travel. I'm not really happy with that." And she looked at me. She looked at this Polish girl, and she said, "He's going to Paris, and he's complaining he's going to Paris, and we will never go to Paris." And humanly speaking, I understood. I made a bullet. I shouldn't have said that in that sense, because she was communist, but I mean, still, it was suffering the idea that you will never go to Paris. And then, in front of you, you have a man with a Polish passport, but I'm going to Paris, and I would like not to go because I was there already, and I have other things to do, and humanly speaking, I understood it was they were suffering, and you have to take that into account.
Okay, Bruno. So the last
In English,
question.
For good documentary, I don't really know. In French, I know a bit, but in English about East Germany, I don't really know. I guess you have much more books about Eastern Germany in English than in French, but it's not a subject I worked on, so I cannot really give you any book. But DDR is a very, very interesting issue. And it's interesting, anecdotically, now they make a poll of opinion in Germany about the Ukraine war, and East Germany stands with Russia.
Oh, there are many Russians in East Germany.
Yeah, but that's very important because it means that the GDR education left something.
I am scared that in the time when this hysteria in Germany finish with the economic ties Germany with Russia, it will be also the moment when they start to make a decommunization in the East Germany, because in East Germany, in every city you have a monument of the Red Army, of Karl Marx, and I am very scared that now they will destroy this, like in Poland.
That's possible, but still, I mean, in Germany, the right is more civilized than in Poland, because the right wing in Germany, even if they are anti-communist, they remind the Hitler time, which destroyed a lot of monuments, and they have that in their past. That's one thing. The second thing is that the German culture respects historical monuments and diversity much more than in Poland, because Germany as a state is a young state, but Germany was always divided in Protestant, Catholic, northern states, southern states. So it was always difficult in Germany to destroy monuments, because one day it's a Protestant country and you have a monument to Luther, and the second day it's Catholic country and you have a monument to the Pope. So we will not destroy the Pope monument and then to destroy the Luther monument. So they have this tradition in Germany. I don't say it will work, but still it can work. We will see, but and we have still, in spite of everything, in Germany, still a more pluralistic political life than in Poland. I think in Poland we have a monolithic life because PO-PiS is one party. There is no big difference on ideological issues between PO, liberals, and so-called populists. They are all in the same line. But in Germany, you still have a little bit more, diversity, for the moment at least.
Okay, Bruno, thank you very much for your big, very long lecture. Now we are updated. We know
I don't know,
everything.
but anyway, I tried. Yeah.
Okay, so I will finish this.